So I'd like to study a little bit of the book of Ruth. We were discussing an introduction to Ruth last time. And then after that, I'd like to go to the Sarada Dibro if we have time, because this is, it's the eve of the holiday, so I'm not sure how much time we have. So first of all, I want to talk about, when did the book of Ruth take place? When did it happen? Also wanted, because we were doing an introduction to the book of Ruth. The other thing I want to mention is um, when who wrote the book of Ruth? So those are two questions I want to take up before we turn to the Ten Commandments. So it says at the beginning of the book of Ruth, it says that the book of Ruth happened Bimei Shvot HaShoftim. It happened in the days of the judges. Shvot HaShoftim, where the judges were judging, or the judges were being judged according to the Midrash, but it doesn't say which judge. Chazal identifies Boaz, who's the main male character in this book, with one of the judges called Ivtzan, who's a minor figure prior to Shimshon, prior to the judge of Samson. But that's not explicit in the text of the Torah. And it's not clear in the text of the book of Ruth. And it's not clear why the book of Ruth doesn't mention which judge it was. Is it because maybe the people didn't know, or because the text doesn't think it's important? So Chazal actually has differences of opinion as to who it was. I mentioned Ivtzan. So there are some within Chazal, who say that actually it goes to the beginning of the era of the book of Judges, which is before Ivtzan, and some put it later on. So we'll go slowly. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that this story happened in the time of Shamgar and Ehud. Ehud was the king. Ehud was the one who assassinated the Eglon Melech Moab. This is the king of Moab, and he said, "I have a message for you." He snuck in. Ehud was left-handed. He snuck into the palace, and he said, "I have a message for you from Hashem." And Eglon was obese, and it was very hard for him to stand, but he stood up because he said, "I got a message from God." And that's when Ehud stuck his knife into Eglon's belly, and Eglon died. And then Ehud escaped. So that's at the very beginning of the period of Judges. And Talmud says that because Eglon honored God by standing up, he took 4 steps, and to hear the message. And as a consequence of this, he merited that his granddaughter Ruth would be the great grandmother of the Mashiach. So that goes back to the period of Ehud. But Rabbi Bar Yitzchak in the Talmud says that this happened the next generation, not in the generation of Ehud, but in the generation of Ehud, of Barak and Devorah. Deborah the prophetess, and her partner in this was Barak. So I'm saying she was married to Barak. But anyway, that's how Rabbi Bar Yitzchak associates it with that period. Whereas in the name of Rav, we have the most famous of all these positions, which is the position that's recorded in Baba Basra 91a, that says that Boaz was associated with the minor judge called Ivtzan. And that's already at the very end of the period of Judges. That's in Judges chapter 12. And it says there that Ivtzan was the judge of now when we say judge, we don't really mean like a judge, like a federal court judge. We mean like a judge is like a tribal chieftain, or almost like a king, a quasi king. So that he was it for 7 years, and then these were the 7 years prior to the time of Samson. So this is at the very end of the book of Judges. Finally, we have one more position, which is not rabbinic, but it might reflect a rabbinic position. And this is the position that's recorded in Josephus's Antiquities. Anybody here read that one? That's a real exciting work. And in Antiquities, Josephus says that he has a tradition from his teachers that this story took place in the time of Eli. And now we know that Eli was hold on. Eli was the Kohen Gadol in the time, the generation before Shmuel the prophetess. And Shmuel is the one who anointed King David. So this story then goes much later, because if Ruth was the great grandmother, you could see right away that it's taking place, and they would have to justify how David was selected as king and what's David's origin story. So this story, basically the story ends by telling us that David was the great grandson of Boaz. So we would assume that it may be anywhere between 60 to 100 years prior to the birth of David. That's when the story took place. So that would seem to identify most likely with at least the beginning of the reign of Eli. So that would make the most sense from a historical perspective, and not to associate it all the way back to the time of Ehud or even Devorah and Barak. Okay, so there are some who wanted to say that we really shouldn't take this story as historically trying to put us to a specific time, and it's coming just to tell us as either a polemic. We discussed this theory against, during the time of the return to Israel after the Babylonian, during the Babylonian return in the time of Ezra, that this became a polemic against those who were trying to tell people to divorce their non-Jewish wives, and they were saying, "Look, these non-Jewish wives, they're the reason why we got here in the first place." But this is not a rabbinic position. In fact, the rabbinic position would argue that our story proves the opposite. That first of all, there's no polemic within the story. The story is the opposite of a polemic. It's all about unity. And also, Ruth is the one, unlike Orpah. Ruth said she accepted upon herself the Jewish people. She said, "Your people are my people." Okay, so this is just a little bit about when this story was written. Who is the one who wrote the book of Ruth? Book of Ruth. It doesn't say who wrote it. It never tells us who wrote this book of Ruth. So there's a tradition in the Talmud in Baba Basra 14b that says that Shmuel the prophet wrote this work. And that would make sense because Shmuel the prophet is the one who anointed King David. And so he would need to justify how David, we already discussed this, that in Yevamos 76, it discusses how could David enter into the people? He's the Moabite, so Shmuel could write this book to justify how David could come in. Now, it says in Baba Basra 14b that Shmuel wrote his book, Kosav Sifro. His book is the book of Shmuel. And he also wrote the book of Judges and book of Ruth. This book clearly goes hand in hand with the book of Judges. There are, the modern scholars don't like to accept this because they always like to knock out the rabbinic approach. So the modern scholars, first of all, you say, well, why do we care who wrote it? Why do we care who wrote it? Is it even relevant to us? Who cares? It's there. So that I would push back on, basically from the Talmud. The Talmud saw earlier, we said in the Talmud that we saw this actually in the Talmud last week. The Talmud asked a question about how exactly was a sacrificial offering made in the times of the wilderness, meaning to say, were they allowed to slaughter animals even though it wasn't a sacrifice in the time of the wilderness? And they were debating it. And Rashi there comments, why do we care? Why do we care? This is the past. I mean, why is this relevant? The Talmud is a book of law. And so Rashi says, because to know the truth is our responsibility. To know what happened, drosh v'kabel schar, to seek something out and to know what happened, that's a Jew's job. A Jew is supposed to know what happened. Drosh v'kabel schar, just to seek it out and receive reward for seeking out the law. So that's what we're required to do. So we want to know. I mean, the question of who wrote it is of spiritual value because it's our responsibility to know as much as possible on the topic. And if we're able to figure out who wrote it, that's part of what our job as a Jew is, to know as much as possible on the topic. And this is relevant to why we stay up and study Torah on Shavuos night. We're trying to study as much as possible, not because we're going to be, halachic decisors and write learned books on the topic, but because it's a Jew's job to know as much as possible as we can on a topic. So that's anyway. So some scholars, going back to this question, want to argue that it was not written in the time of Shmuel, but it was written later, either during the time of the rebuilding of the Second Temple. But Yechezkel Kaufman wrote that he rejects that because the Second Temple period is about the reason why people want to put it to the beginning of the Second Temple period, because the book of Ezra discusses the need to get, like purity of blood. But he says this doesn't seem like that's the purpose of this book. So it's really strange to associate it with that. Okay. And furthermore, the book clearly, its main point is not about the lineage of, the purity of the marriage between Ruth and Boaz, but the main point really seems to be about King David and his lineage. And that's most relevant for the First Temple, not for the Second Temple, because we no longer had the Davidic dynasty ruling over us in the Second Temple. And so therefore it would be strange to say that there would be a book proving his origin. So therefore it's most likely written in the First Temple period. Finally, another scholar suggests that it was written in the First Temple, but towards the end of the First Temple period, during the time of the kings of Judah, during the war between the Mesha, the king of Moab, in the days of Yoshaphat and Yoram. This is in the second book of Kings, chapter 3, verse 5. But that's also problematic to get into it. And so anyway, at the end of the day, if there's no convincing argument otherwise, why wouldn't we accept Chazal's position, which is that this book was written during the time period of Shmuel? Finally, one more thing to point out before we go and study a little bit about the Ten Commandments is that there are many comparisons. It's always good to think about a book and its context in the rest of the Bible. There are many comparisons between the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. Book of Esther we read on the holiday of Purim. It's a scroll in and of itself. It's not a prophecy, but a story. So too, Megillah Ruth is not a prophecy, but a story. There are clear distinctions. Book of Esther seems to be secular on its face. The book of Ruth is very divine. The name of God is flowing off of their lips, whereas that name of God is totally absent from the book of Esther. Book of Esther, the Jewish people remain in diaspora. And book of Ruth, they return to the land of Israel. But there are a lot of similarities between the two, which which we should highlight and focus on, because they go to an overarching biblical theme. But both of these Megillot are named after women who are, powerful, strong women. Um, uh, Ruth and Esther, both of the books begin with the words Vayehi, which the Talmud associates with distress, and both of them, the feminine character is a heroine. Esther is a heroine, and Ruth is clearly a heroine. You could even argue that Naomi is a heroine, as she manipulates the process to protect her family's fortunes. So, in both there's a lot of similarities there, but the differences between the two stories are, of course, actually greater. In Esther, um, a Jewish girl goes to the palace of a king and of a foreign king. And in Ruth, it's the opposite. The Ruth, who the rabbis identify with being a princess of Moab, she comes and goes to the Jewish land of kings. She becomes the great grandmother of the kings. So it's the reverse story in that way. Esther goes and becomes a queen to non-Jews, and Ruth goes and becomes the mother to Jewish kings. Esther, the whole story is dependent and surrounds the fate of the people, and Ruth is about individuals. But really, it's the opposite, because Ruth is about saving individuals, but that individual turns out to be, who she saved is actually the king, King David. And so by working to save an individual, she ends up saving the whole kingdom. Whereas Esther is about saving the people and not saving an individual. The individuals who she saved are not even mentioned at all. But in the end of the day, really, she might have saved them temporarily, but the people remained in bondage. So maybe the message there is that real redemption happens on an individual level and not on a national level. That's a point for another time. There's a lot discussing. There's a lot of mention of the gates. There was some business goings on at the gates of the city, and in the book of Esther, Mordechai was protesting, and he came to the Shar HaMelech, to the entrance to the king. One more difference is that book of Ruth happens at the very beginning of the biblical era, and the book of Esther happens at the very end of it. But the main difference is the main difference is about the perspective. What happened here?
What happened here?
I'm hearing myself and
echo.
Okay, so
the main difference.
I don't know why I'm here.
I don't know why I'm here.
This is no good. Can you hear me? Okay, I was hearing an echo, but now it's fine. But the main difference is one of perspective. That in the book of Esther, it takes place over many, many years, and the story is basically telling us that Hashem is deciding everything for us without our knowledge. That God, through his divine providence, decides everything. It takes place over 9 years, and human beings are just pawns in the divine plan. Whereas in the book of Ruth, it seems, this is the point that Meltzer makes his introduction to Da'at Mikra, it seems that the divine providence is basically drawing and influenced by the actions of Ruth. that Ruth is able to impact history. So with her strength and desire to join the Jewish people, she transforms it. And so therefore, obviously there is divine providence, but she impacts the divine providence in a way that's less clear from the story of Ruth, the story of Esther. Finally, I want to make one last point here, and that is that at the end of the book of Ruth, it says a phrase that I remember for a long time. It says here, it says, hold on, let me see. It says in the verse, in chapter 4, verse 11, and all the people that were in the gate of the elders said, let Hashem give this woman, i.e. Ruth, who comes into your house, make her be like Rachel and Leah, asher banu shtehem et Beit Israel, that they built the house of Israel. So they praise her to be like Rachel and Leah, which is, first of all, ironic because she was married into the tribe of Judah, and Rachel was not the matriarch for Judah. She was the matriarch for Joseph and Benjamin. And here they were being praised. And not only that, they praised her by putting Rachel before Leah. And that's highlighting the concept of unity, that David is connected to them. But also we see that Ruth, who was this person who was not born Jewish, is the true descendant of Rachel and Leah. Unlike Esther, she was Hadassah, she was born Jewish, but then she intermarried with Achashverosh, and while certainly, obviously, she was considered to be, a prophetess and righteous, but she is not called a descendant of Rachel and Leah. That title, which is the only time it appears in the Bible, is reserved for Ruth, who's the only Jewish woman in the Bible who's not an actual biological descendant of Rachel and Leah. So that's something that I wanted to highlight. Let me just pause for a moment. I see Thera is unmuted. Were you trying to say something, Thera? Baruch Hashem, it's the practice, we'll study now for just a few minutes about the Ten Commandments. It's a practice on the first day of Shavuos to read the passage of the Ten Commandments, the Aseres Hadibros. And the Ten Commandments, the reason why we read on the first day of Shavuos is because the anniversary of Matan Torah, it's the anniversary of the giving of the Torah at Sinai. Which Torah? The first set of the Ten Commandments. So let's just look at the verse, which is introduction to the Ten Commandments. That this is the words that introduce the Ten Commandments. And God spoke all of these words saying, God spoke all of these words saying. So usually it would say, or what does it mean, all of these words? And in fact, it's not so simple that God spoke all of these words, because according to the Midrash, he didn't speak all these words, that he just spoke the beginning and the rest was spoken by Moshe. So let's look at the Rashi on these words, and then let's look at the Talmud from Chagiga, and then we'll look at a teaching from Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk, and then we'll call it an afternoon to get ready for Yontif. So it says, Vayidaber Elokim. The word Elokim, the name of God, is usually associated with judgment. So Rashi says here, Ein Elokim Ela Dayan. The word Elokim is an expression of judgment, because there are some passages in the Torah that if you do them, you receive reward, but if you don't do them, you don't receive a punishment for them. I might think that the Ten Commandments is, let's say, if you keep let's say if you do them, you receive a reward, but if you don't do them, you don't get a punishment. So we say Elokim, God is the judge and will exact punishment. What does it teach us that God said all of these words? So here Rashi tells us, this teaches us that God said the Ten Commandments with one utterance. God uttered one sound, and all of the Ten Commandments were said at that exact moment. And this is impossible for a human being to speak or hear in this manner. Well, it was. Now it's possible. Clearly, you can use technology to accomplish the same task. So what does it mean when it says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha v'lo yelcha? So that means after God spoke it all at once, God goes back and said each one by itself. So that's the way Rashi understands it. Okay, what does it mean? God spoke all of these words, lay more. And so this teaches us, says the Midrash, that the people responded to what they were supposed to say yes, they said yes. What they were supposed to say no, they said no to. But the Talmud has a different version of it. The Talmud tells us as follows. The Talmud tells us, this teaches us to teach you that the scholars were sitting there what does it mean God spoke all of these words? Here's a beautiful idea from the Gemara Chagiga. Is to teach you that Chachamim who sit in a yeshiva and they're studying Torah, even though some people say this piece of meat is treif and this piece of meat is kosher. Some say that this person is disqualified and the other one says this person is qualified. Some prohibit you to do this on Shabbos. Others permit it. Nevertheless, says the Gemara in Chagiga, all of these opinions, even contradictory opinions, were said by God. All of them are one opinion. All of them are not one opinion, but all of them are from one source. Meaning, say, even though they're contradictory, they all come from Hashem. They're saying totally opposite things. Let's say one person says, the genetically manufactured pig is kosher. And the other one says the genetically manufactured pig is treif. They say opposite things, but the Talmud says, when it says God spoke all of these things, both opinions are directly from Hashem. That's the radical teaching of the Talmud. And what this means is, there's a concept in the Talmud, it says the Torah Tamima, called Elu be'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. Both these and these, meaning both words, even though they're opposite, are considered to be associated with the living God. And that means the reason why we have that is because based upon the context, we might need a different analysis of it. Another explanation, says the Torah Tamima, is that through different opinions comes different explanations, and that's how you get to the truth of the matter. You need people arguing and discussing and debating to finally get to the fundamental truth. And in this context, the Torah can only be acquired through a community, not for an individual. An individual studying by himself will not make it. It has to be different people studying to go together. And that will allow the Torah to be studied properly and spread forth. So this is the concept of why it says God spoke all of these words. This verse, Vayidaber Elokim es kol hadvarim ha'elu lemor, has 7 words in it. Vayidaber Elokim es kol hadvarim ha'elu lemor. So God spoke 7 words. And also the first verse in the Torah, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, also has 7 words. Also, the most powerful phrase from the Kaddish, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Olam Umel Maya, also has 7 words. So the Panach Raza explains that whoever says Yehi Shmei Rabba with all his strength becomes a partner of God in the creation of the world, and it's as though he received the Ten Commandments directly from God. So that's why it's so powerful to say the Yehi Shmei Rabba loudly. And finally, we want to just say the teaching of Rebbe Melch of Lezhinsk on this first verse, Vaydaber Kim is called Verma more. And then it says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God. So Rebbe Melch says, we read it like this: Kol HaTorah, the entire Torah, I mean, all of these words were said. What's the purpose of the whole Torah? It's just so that the whole world will know that I am Hashem your God. The whole purpose of the Torah is for us to acknowledge Hashem's presence above us. That's how Rebbe Melch reads this way. Dabra Kim is called more, so that you should know Anochi, so that you should know I am Hashem your God. Okay, this is the teaching for today. I hope the folks can join us